Hey, welcome everyone. Welcome to another Friday edition of Elevate.Strategy live leadership unplugged fireside chat, whatever you want to call it. And of course, the reason why I've called it unplugged and fireside chat is because these interviews are intended to be more of an intimate view of leaders, business leaders, and from various places and industries and skill sets as well. And they've often been very much a casual conversation about their careers and about some of their accomplishments and also what they're very much an expertise in. So today we have a wonderful guest who is truly an expert in what she does. And we'll talk about introducing her in a second. But first, I wanted to ask you guys, I wanted to get your opinion on several things. We had a loss in our family this week. And, one of our pets died, essentially. And, I found it really difficult to focus and concentrate on working through what it was that I did. And for, a couple of hours, I even forgot what it was that I did for a living. And it was very difficult to get through. And so I'm wondering, if any of you have experienced the same thing. Obviously you have. And what was it that you did to kind of get through that and sort of, power through and make sure that you still were able to be productive and be positive? And what kind of support did you bring to your life? So really curious about that. Now, if you're here live, please do drop a note down in the comment box where you are. Love to hear whereabouts you're from. If you're from Asia, Australia, Middle East, whatever it is, would love to hear you. If you post production, that's great too. Again, reach out to me, reach out to our guest today. We'd love to hear from you and to just connect with you. So without further ado, I wanted to introduce our guest today, which is why you are here, obviously. Her name is Beverly Behan, and she is the president of Board Advisor LLC and one of the foremost global experts on board effectiveness, having worked with nearly 200 boards of directors over the past 25 years. Beverly has worked with boards globally on a range of issues and provides advice to board chairs and new CEOs about optimizing their effectiveness in leading and working with their boards. Bev is the author of the governance classic, Great Companies Deserve Great Boards, which was named Governance Board of the Year by Directors and Boards magazine in 2012. Her latest book, which I have here, Becoming a Boardroom Star, was developed from interviews with thousands of board members around the globe. It debuted in September 2021 as the #1 new release on Amazon in corporate governance. So an exciting time, and this book is awesome. All right, so we're going to introduce Bev to the front stage.
Hi, Simeon. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I really appreciate it, and I'm so glad you like the new book.
Yeah, it was. When I read it, the first thing that I realize is that I know very little about what goes on in boards, and as much as I've been coaching for a while, and I have some board, I had so much takeaways that I could bring into my practice in coaching folks who want to join boards, right? And so what I also found very, very cool about this book was the interview. So the insights from the various people that you had spoken with, and just their perspectives on, even dynamics within the board, and kind of, you had a statistic around, the number of, board members that you interviewed who wished that others would be kicked out of the board, and, whatever it was. So it
Well,
was sort of
that actually wasn't my interview. That was PricewaterhouseCoopers.
okay,
And
great.
what's interesting about that study, Simeon, is that they've been doing that study since 2012.
Okay.
And so
Okay.
they interview 700 board members of public companies across
Okay.
the United States. Okay, so this is American data.
Mm,
But these are people on boards of public companies, so companies that are listed on the NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange.
gotcha.
And they ask them a whole lot of different questions. And one question they say is there somebody on your board that you think should be replaced?
Okay.
And 49% of them said, yes, there is. Okay. So that's half the board in America, half the boards in America. And this is like directors themselves. Okay. This isn't the
Sure.
CEO who says, I've got a board member that's dogging it. I mean, these are
Yeah.
directors themselves. And then they asked them, is there more than one? And 21% said, yeah, I think two or more need to go. So I think
Right.
it's what's also interesting about that data is that this isn't like a one of. It was
Right.
the same result in 2019. And the study has actually just come out. It came out about a week ago for
Okay.
2021. And I think it was still 47%.
Right.
So it's
Right.
consistent. And what it shows, frankly, is that one of the biggest problems in the boardroom today is a lack of really good director performance management. And when
Right.
you think about
Yeah.
it, the board is very demanding about performance. Okay. If the
Right.
CEO isn't hitting the numbers, if they think the CFO is kind of, not doing well in talking to the Wall Street analysts, or in some of their deals, or if there's an underperforming division, the board will be very quick to say, hey, we have to hold these executives accountable, right? And then when it comes to the board, you've got half the boards themselves saying, we've got people on here that really should be replaced. And
Right.
so it really detracts from the board's credibility, and
Mm-hmm.
particularly from the credibility of board leadership when they
Right.
continuously turn a blind eye to director performance management. So don't look at the people on our board, but we want to hold management and the CEO and all the executives very accountable. There's a
Right.
disconnect there, and
Gotcha.
it impairs their credibility.
Gotcha. And we'll get to more of that in a second. I did. I mean, the part of these interviews are really. I'm curious and fascinated about how people and why their journeys got to where they are today, right? And you obviously had so much experience in this area, but if you could just spend a couple of minutes just sort of sharing with the audience about how you got to where you are today, and
Sure.
what was fascinating about the journey, that'd be great. And then I'd love to talk about this book. I have a lot of questions to you about people want to join boards and all that stuff. So can
Yeah.
you share with us about your journey a little bit?
I'm happy to do that, Simeon. So, how I got interested in boards is back when I was an impressionable young attorney in my early 30s. I worked for a large airline that no longer exists. And it was called Canadian Airlines International. They were based out of Calgary and Vancouver. They were kind of in Western Canada.
Right.
And I'm really dating myself because if we go back to the first Gulf War, what was basically happening was fuel prices had gone through the roof and
Hmm.
nobody was flying because they
Right.
were afraid. And so airlines all over the world were suffering terribly. And in Canada, unlike the United States, where they have Chapter 11 and they can operate in
Hmm.
bankruptcy, Canada doesn't have that provision. And
Right.
so once we declared bankruptcy under the Canadian code, which is called CCAA, they were going to start, seizing our jets in Hong
Okay.
Kong and in Japan and wherever else we had them. So a group of employees, led by a guy who had been a senior vice president, um, came up with this idea of a wages for stock deal. And I got involved in working on that, in negotiating with our unions, our pilots, our flight attendants, our ticket agents, and we got them all on board. And they all agreed to give up a percentage of their pay for stock in the company.
Right.
And I will tell you that at the time, the culture and the atmosphere of this company was absolutely electric. People took so much pride in saving the company, and everybody kind of got together, and it really culminated, frankly, in a meeting at the hangar at the Vancouver airport,
Okay.
where the guy who was the CEO of the company at the time, who was not well liked, by the way, and who was really not, I'm not sure how in favor he was of this deal, to be honest, but he
Right.
stood up at the Vancouver hangar and he said, to show solidarity with all of our unionized employees, everybody in management, starting with me, is going to take a 20% pay cut and we're going to take
Right.
stock. Okay.
Wow. Okay.
So everybody kind of holds hands and sings kumbaya, and that's all beautiful until the proxy circular comes out about 3 or 4 months later. And because we've made all our unionized employees shareholders and all of our employees shareholders, all of a sudden they're looking at the proxy because they now own stock in the company.
Right.
And
Right.
let's look at the executive compensation disclosure, where it shows the top 5 executives, what they've made for the last few years.
Right.
And we look at the CEO, and yeah, his pay's down a little, but that sure doesn't look like 20% to me. Let me get out my calculator. No, it's 4%. What's that
4%?
about?
Okay.
4%. Yeah. So the heads of our unions went ballistic. Okay.
Right.
And they
Right.
said, well, you said this was going to be a 20% cut. And this memo came out that basically said, well, because I'm under so much stress as the CEO right now, the board voted me a pay increase, but then they levied like the full 20%.
Okay. Wow.
Oh, yeah. So you can imagine how that played. We had wildcat strikes at some of the big Canadian airports.
Mhm.
It was really bad scene. And so then on the heels of that, the board, and again, I just emphasize, we had created an environment where all of our employees were now shareholders. Okay.
Right.
So the board sent a letter to the homes of every employee. And one might think that they would say, gee, we're really sorry. We shouldn't have given this guy a raise. This was not a good idea. Please forgive us. No, it didn't say anything like that.
Okay.
What it said was, you're lucky to have a job and you need to
Wow.
stop complaining about the CEO and the
Wow.
company and put your nose down and get your job done.
Wow.
Now, the corporate culture died that day. The
Yeah.
company died that day. Okay. Our
Hmm.
morale died that day. And so, in the aftermath of that, this CEO who got the raise became a lightning rod of
Mhm.
employee
Mhm.
discontent. Okay.
Okay.
And the board realized they had to get rid of this guy. Now, just to get the timing, I mean, this is like in the early 90s. So, just as we came up with this solution, so we weren't operating in bankruptcy, many American airlines were operating in bankruptcy, and the classic one was Continental.
Right.
And right at that time, the guy who was, David Bonderman, who was getting Continental basically out of bankruptcy, he went to Boeing and he
Mhm.
recruited Gord Bethune, who is probably one of the greatest airline CEOs in history, to go and run Continental. And Continental's comeback is the stuff of, business legends. So right at the time that Bonderman is out recruiting Bethune at Boeing, what is our board at Canadian Airlines doing? Okay. And by the way, our board is comprised of absolutely marquee name people. Okay. One of
Mhm.
them went on to become a justice on the Supreme Court of Canada.
Right.
These are people who are all on the cover of, the Financial Post, the Canadian Business, what have you. Okay. What are they doing while Bonderman is recruiting Bethune to run Continental? Who are they looking for to replace the lightning rod CEO? Well, they're looking about as far as the lobby to the elevator of our corporate headquarters, because they choose the next CEO. Okay, this is an airline,
Right.
Simeon, right?
Right.
Think
Right.
about what you'd probably be looking for in your airline CEO. They chose a guy who was the CEO of a property management company.
What?
Yeah. a Canadian-based property management company. And where did they find him? We're not exactly sure, but we think in the elevator, because this property management company's head office was in the same office tower in Calgary as the airline's head office.
Wow.
So the rumors sort of went around the company, which is like, the board members must have got in. They met this guy. What do you do? He said, I'm a CEO. They said, oh, we're looking for a CEO. So needless to say, this guy takes over as CEO, isn't able to bring back the confidence of the employees,
Right.
And basically manages the further decline of the airline until it's sold off at a fire sale price to our rival Air Canada. And as a result, tens of thousands of people, including a lot of my friends, lost their jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And I got interested in boards because
Right.
I saw the decisions that this board made. This board of people, I was young enough and naive enough that I believed that the board was supposed to be where the buck stopped. The
Right.
board was supposed to be where these successful, talented business leaders put their shoulder to the wheel and said, hey, this might not be right, and let's rethink this, and here's some ideas. And that's what I thought a board was supposed to be.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I was appalled by, some of these decisions, like, the raise, the letter, the choice of CEO. This was just really tone deaf stuff. And I left the airline. I went back into private practice in a law firm. I was doing securities and corporate finance. So I was taking companies public. And all those boards were pretty lackluster too. I mean, they had impressive people on them, but they operated like a country club.
Right.
And I was so disillusioned by this, and I'd seen the impact of bad board decisions on my friends.
Right.
And
Right.
in the midst of this report came out of the Toronto Stock Exchange. It was called the Day Report, and it came in the heels of a British report called Cabri that came out in 92.
Right.
And I read this Day Report, Simeon. I read it on English Bay Beach in Vancouver like it was a dirty novel, because I'm reading this thing and it's talking about that what I had seen, well, they're legion. It was this scathing rebuke of the state of corporate governance in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And I was absolutely riveted by this. And my friends that I'm at the beach with are saying, what are you reading? And I said, I'm reading this corporate governance thing. And they said, girl, you got to get a life. And
Yeah.
I said, you know what? I think I just found a life, because
Right.
what is going on here is not sustainable and it's not right.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what I want to do. And this is the field I want to work in. So that's really the backstory of how I ended up getting into my work with boards.
Were you someone who liked to solve those kinds of problems to begin with? Is that kind of what you grew up looking at, how leadership affected, your law practice, or what kind of a leader you were? Is
No,
leadership
I,
something you
I
did?
didn't even know anything about boards until I was in my early 30s and starting to work with them. So
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
they were foreign. And I think this is something that's interesting too, is that, often when you're in university or early in your career, people expect you to know, oh, you're going to do this, you're going to do
Right.
that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I think sometimes in the early stages of your career, and even the first like 20 years of your career, that's when you often come upon things that give you fresh ideas, and
Yeah.
you decide, I'm going to make a change because this is something I think I want to do, and this is
Mm-hmm.
something I think I have the skills to do.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I had an interview with where I was interviewed by the Association of Executive Search Consultants. We just released the interview there, and one of the things that I noticed with my clients is that they talk a lot about the Great Resignation and all that, and I mean certainly people are leaving their jobs, but I think the reason for that is even into their 50s, people are trying to figure out what it is that really makes them tick, and so. Without asking that question, right? Because I think there's an expectation that you're old enough now to know, but in reality, most people don't really they don't really know. They don't really know, and so, but okay, so how did you get started? What was your first foray into advising a board, it's difficult to get onto one, right? And we'll talk about
Well,
that.
I've never been on a board, and that's conscious because I consider it a conflict of interest. So, yeah,
Okay.
okay. So I've been, in fact, this morning somebody asked me if I would go on a NASDAQ. I'm like, no, it's a conflict of interest. So to me, I want to be on one side of the board table or the other. So after I was at this law firm and I was doing securities and corporate finance, and they were very happy for me to build a governance practice for them in the law firm, but it was really about regulatory compliance. And I felt
Right.
that the problems on boards and the issues I wanted to tackle went way beyond that. In fact, I remember
Mhm.
telling this one partner, I said, I'm not interested in putting lipstick on a pig.
Right. Right.
So and one thing I would say also, I think I was miserable as a lawyer. I never liked it. I know a lot of lawyers who are. And, I don't think it's a good idea to stay in a job you're miserable at. But before you go walking out of that job, I think it's very important to do the research and figure out where you want to go.
Hmm.
And, a lot of people just knee jerk, oh, I'm miserable here. I'm just going to leave.
Right.
Well, sometimes you go from the frying pan into the fire because all of a sudden you don't have an income, you don't have any place to go in the morning. So I stayed after I realized after that little, sojourn on English Bay Beach, and I was like, this is what I want to do. I then spent a good, I would say 4 or 5 months researching
Hmm.
because in those days, I mean, this is the, mid 90s, nobody was doing this kind of work.
Right.
And I would spend a lot of my spare time reading articles and journals, and I would reach out to people. I was on the West Coast, and so I could have conversations with people at like 7 in the morning, which
Right.
in, Toronto or New York or Chicago was, much later in the day. And so I used that to my advantage. I talked to a lot of people and I really fleshed out um, different avenues to kind of get into this work and whether there really was a job there. Because, you know, if you said to people as I did in sort of the 94 type of period, like, I want to start working with boards, they're like, no one does that. Like, do you want to be a headhunter? I'm like, no.
Right.
You want to
Right.
be a lawyer? No. I'm like, I actually want to make boards an asset to the companies they govern, because I think a lot of them aren't that now, and they're comprised of really smart people, and I don't think we're taking advantage of that. So
Yeah.
that's what I want
Yeah.
to do. And I think whenever you want to move into an area that is not a well-worn path, and often that's where some of the most rewarding, um, you know, uh, jobs are when you kind of create them yourself, you have to do the research to really figure that out. And so I got what I thought was a very good piece of advice from one guy I talked to in the course of this research,
Hmm.
and he said you should consider going into executive compensation consulting. And
Okay.
I said, "What is that?"
Right.
And he
Right.
told me, well, boards hire someone to tell them what to pay the CEO. And I was astounded by that. I said, these boards are so useless, they can't even figure out what to pay the CEO. And he's like, it's a very well paying line of work. And I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. And he
Wow.
said, well, this is the reason I think you should do it. Because he said, as an attorney, like, you're not in the boardroom enough. Like, you're there to close a deal. You're
Right.
there at the time everybody's signing off to take the company public. And he said, this would get you like in the boardroom day in and day out. And that's what I decided to do. I looked
Hmm.
into that. And so I went to William Mercer. I had a couple of offers from different executive comp firms.
Right.
I
Right.
had a background that interested them, right? Because I was a lawyer with an MBA. And so they thought that was great.
Hmm.
Um, I wasn't the least bit interested in executive comp.
Right.
But I was interested in boards. And from the time I went in, I said, I'm interested in broader issues of board effectiveness. Now, their first, reaction to that was like, we don't really care. You
Right.
just put your nose down and learn how to crunch those stock option numbers. Okay.
Right.
But I really did listen. And it wasn't my boss. It was my boss's boss at the time who ran the practice, not only in Canada, but also in the United States and Britain.
Hmm.
And one of the big Canadian banks was his client,
Okay.
and they had a shareholder activist. And it was very prominent in the Canadian media. And yes, the activist had issues around executive pay, but they had way broader issues around the board. And so he reached out to me and said, I need you on a flight to Toronto. So I went there, and he and I are in this elevator up at the very top of this bank. I won't say which one it was. A lot of people know though. And you know, this guy comes in that we're meeting with, and my boss is just kind of really fawning all over him, to be honest.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
I'm sort of younger and even blonder then, and the guy kind of turns to me and says, kind of like, "What are you doing here, honey?" Sort of look. And I said, so I think that you have way bigger problems than this. I said, I've done an
Right.
analysis, and your CEO holds like less stock in this company
Right.
than 1 year's bonus. And I think that your shareholders deserve better. And you're really lucky that the activist hasn't brought that up yet.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
he's like, oh. And then another thing, and let's not forget, this is in the mid 1990s. I said, your CEO sits on his own compensation committee.
Right.
And said,
Mhm.
oh, but he's a non-voting member.
Huh.
And I said, you've got to be kidding me. Nobody really thinks that he sits quietly in those
Right.
meetings. And I
Right.
said, so those are two things that if I were you, I'd get out ahead of that before the activists find it. Because if I could find that reading your stuff on a flight from Vancouver to Toronto, you've got a problem.
Right. Right.
Anyway, all the way down, it was 60 some floors. This comp guy is like, you shouldn't have said those things to the vice chairman of the bank, blah, blah, blah. And I just thought, you know what? This is the kind of stuff I actually want to do. And I'm not really interested in crunching the stock option numbers. And so this was my shot, and I took it. And if you don't like it, too bad. Like, I'll go do something else.
Mhm.
Well, the
Mhm.
next morning, I had stayed over that night, and the phone rings at like 7:30 in the morning, and it's my boss's boss, and he says, "So last
Wow.
night, this chair CEO resigned from the compensation committee, put through a buy order for $1 million in stock, and you're hired. And they want to
Wow.
see you at 9 in the morning." So I
Wow.
went over there. That was kind of my big career break. And then from
Mm.
there, they allowed me to do a board evaluation and a director evaluation. And that was the first, they were one of the first major companies in North America that did that. And they won a lot of awards for that. And it allowed me, when I moved to New York, 4 years later, nobody in the States had even done this stuff.
Right. Right.
So, and then when I moved to New York, really what had happened is Mercer, which was owned by Marcia McLennan, they had made an acquisition in New York of a boutique consulting firm called Delta. They called it Mercer Delta. And
Okay.
they wanted to learn more about boards, and they wanted to build a board practice because they did a lot of work consulting to CEOs and executive teams. And so I was transferred down to help, start that. What I
Right.
didn't know, and which also was very fortuitous, was that um, within a year, so by 2001, Enron fell. And
Okay.
suddenly,
Yeah.
right? And so here I am, who's somebody who was like reading, the day report on English Bay Beach in Vancouver saying, I want to work with boards.
Right.
And literally within 5 years, I'm in Midtown Manhattan during the fall of Enron, and I'm getting quoted in the Wall Street Journal. I'm getting quoted in Business Week. And all of a sudden, corporate governance and boards were the hottest topic in corporate America, and I
Wow.
was at the center of it.
Right.
So
Right.
that's really
Right.
my journey and how I moved into this space.
Wow. Okay. Well, there's so many the intersection points between your those 4 or 5 months that you did the research and the reading that it probably equipped you to think properly about these things, and then these opportunities that came up so that you were ready to kind of say something when something needed to be said, right? And then of course the environmental things like Enron coming into your lap. It's you can't really predict those things. But I mean, at the very end of it is that your core interest and your passion was there that drove you to kind of do that research, right? That people need to think about when they're thinking about switching careers or kind of doing something different that other people don't do. And I think in that course of discovery, sometimes that's where you find where there is places that people don't activate today. So maybe that's where you can go into, right? Let
Well,
me.
I think also, people often will say, "Well, I'm miserable in my job. I hate my job." And they'll go on about, what they don't like. They don't like their boss, they don't like their pay, they don't like their clients, they don't like their work, they don't like whatever it is,
Right,
okay, about
right,
this job. And they can tell you about that. And then you stop and you say to them, "Okay, so what is it that you want to do?"
right.
And they'll give you this deer in the headlights look like, "Well, I don't know."
Anything
That's
but that.
the question.
Anything but what I just said to you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the question. And I don't believe that we have this one perfect job any more than I necessarily believe we have this one perfect soulmate either. I think that there are a number of jobs, just like there are a number of relationships that can all make you really happy. And so if you're really looking to do a major shift, I think it's a good idea to think about more than one thing. I always had in my mind, I knew I wanted to do the board thing. It was my number one choice, but I also knew that it was really plowing new turf.
Mhm.
And I wasn't really sure I could make it go.
Right.
So I had two fallback careers, both of which I think I would have been happy in, although maybe not quite as happy. So I think it's important to also not limit yourself and say, oh, this is my dream job and I'll never be happy if I don't get this.
Right. Right.
I think that there's a lot of skills that highly educated people today have, and they can all make better contributions than in a job where they're miserable.
Right. Sure. I want to talk about this, your book, just because I
Yeah.
want to make sure we cover this. So during the COVID, I know you wrote a number of books, or maybe sort of the framework for books during the COVID
Yeah,
lockdown.
I wrote 3 books during COVID.
All right. Well, case in point. But what was the inspiration for this one here? This is called Becoming a Boardroom Star. What was this? What was the inspiration for that?
Well, one of the main things that happened, I would say, that really started last in the summer of 2020 with the Black Lives Matter movement, the social justice movement, was there was a unprecedented level of diversity recruitment on boards of directors. And there's a study that, just came out from, I think, Heidrick and Struggles had one. I think Spencer Stewart has one. So, you work a lot with these firms. And I think Spencer's was looking at the S&P 500, and of the 400 new directors recruited to the S&P 500 in the last year, 40% were women, at least 40% for women, and about 40% were also ethnic minorities.
Okay.
And we have never seen this level of diversity recruitment taking place in boards, in public companies, S&P 500s. And so
Right.
during all of this, I had friends who were senior executives or retired senior executives who were
Mm.
Black, who were Asian, who were women, and they were getting recruited onto boards for the first time.
Okay.
And they called me up and they said, guess what? I just got recruited on my first board and I'm excited because I always wanted to go on a board and I'm excited
Mhm.
about this company. And then they would say, what I want though is I want to know from you, because you've worked with so many boards, what do I need to know to be a really great director?
Right. Sure.
Because I want to hit it out of the park. I don't want to be like the token director. I want to be that, like, 2 years from now, they look back
Right.
and they say,
Yeah.
we're
Yeah.
so glad we recruited you. You're like one of the best board members we've ever had. What do
Yeah.
I need to do? And of course, this is what my friends would say, which is why they're my friends, right? But many, many directors are of that view. They don't just want to go on a board. They want to have real influence and impact in the boardroom, and they want to be a really great
Mhm.
director. They want to be a role model to the executive team and the people that work in the company. And so after having
Mm.
several of these Zoom calls with my friends, often over wine, I went for a long walk in Central Park,
Right.
and I decided that I wanted to write Becoming a Boardroom Star because I just finished writing 2 books during the lockdowns, and I honestly didn't want to write another book, but I said, I just think this is a book that is needed right now because I want these diverse directors to hit it out of the park. And in the course of my work with boards over the last 25 years, a lot of my work involves board evaluations and director
Mhm.
evaluations. And so I'm constantly interviewing directors in confidence about look at your peers. Who are the directors you think are the best directors on your board? And then what impresses you so much? What makes them so valuable and so good? And
Right.
then the flip side, if you look at who should be replaced or who you think are the
Right.
less effective directors, what is getting in the way? What is detracting from their
Mhm.
performance or from the esteem in which you hold them? And so I had done all this work over the last 2.5 decades, and I just decided that this was a good foundation to write Becoming a Boardroom Star. And one of the things, Simeon, that was very interesting when I finished the manuscript, I sent it not only to some board members in the US and Canada to take a look at before I finalized it for their feedback. I sent it to a director in Kuala Lumpur. I sent it to someone in Tel Aviv. I sent
Okay.
it to someone in Bogota, Colombia. And here's what I found really interesting. All those people from outside North America, their reaction to it was, oh my God, this is exactly what I've seen. Oh, I so agree with this. Oh, that story about this director, it's happened to me.
Right.
And
Right.
what I realized was that this book is not just a North American book, it's a global book.
Right.
And I
Right.
thought that was really interesting too.
Yeah, because you speak a lot about the dynamics, what it means to be a board committee chair and what does that dynamics look like with the executive team. And what I love about it is that you get very specific and almost tactical to the point where people can relate to, okay, the next time I'm in this situation, perhaps I need to think this way or do this thing or say this thing, right? And oftentimes when you read a board book, a lot of it has to do with the grander scale of developing a strategy for the organization. How do you make sure that you're but this book is really encompassing of all that, but really also geared towards, if I were a board member. And actually that's my next question is, a lot of folks that are in the audience that I coach are first time board members,
Yeah.
and they are asking that question, what are two or three things that they need to know, right, to be very effective. So what would you say to them?
Well, I think that first of all, getting on a board is one thing, but
Mm.
having real impact and influence in the boardroom is something else. And
Right.
so, I'm not a recruiter, right? So, unlike many of the people in organizations you're affiliated with, I don't do search, but I really focus on how to make the most of the talent you have in the boardroom and how directors can be effective and how boards can be effective. So, I'm that second part. You've got on the board, and now how do I hit it out of the park in the boardroom? So for a new director, I would give probably three pieces of advice. First of all, uh, most director orientation programs are a drinking from a fire hose experience. Okay.
Mm.
So what they'll do is they'll say, you're a new director. You're going to go now prior to COVID. Okay. How it all worked was you would go to the company's head office and they would whisk you around executive row and you would meet with the CEO, the CFO, the chief legal officer, the head of HR, the head of marketing, whatever. And you would sit and try to digest this
Okay.
dizzying download of information, okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
over the course of this 1 day or 2 day
Yeah.
orientation program. Okay. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing that. At least you got to meet the executive team and they got to meet you and you had
Mhm.
some idea what these issues are. But it was like an overwhelming thing. Now,
Right. Right.
one of the silver linings of COVID is this was largely done on video. So it gave you a little breathing space. You didn't have to have it back to back. But even prior to COVID, I think a lot of companies were saying like this process, it's okay, but we
Right.
need to supplement this. And some of the best directors that I've worked with, right out of the gates, they said, look, of course I would go to the director orientation, but then I asked to do another session on this, or I asked if I could
Right.
specifically take a meet, and they designed their own kind of phase two of
Mm.
orientation because what you're trying to do as a new board member is learn as much about the organization as you can. And I
Mhm.
think that applies whether it's a public company like S&P 1500 where I mostly work, or even if you've gone on the board of a local hospital or university or charity, finding out what's really going on in this organization, who their competitors are, what their customers or stakeholders are, what's really going on.
Mhm.
The more you learn right from the beginning, the better director you're going to be right out of the gates because you're going
Right.
to have good context. And often you shouldn't just rely on the company or the board to put this program together because you're going to have this drinking from the fire hose experience. And
Right.
so,
Sure.
like I say, never tell them, oh, I'm not going to go on your board about or your orientation program. All right. Of course, you're going to do it, but
Right.
look for ways, sometimes, particularly if you're a young executive and you're going on a board. By the way, I happen to think that sitting on the other side of a board table is really great professional development experience for top executives that aspire to be a CEO.
Okay.
Because
Great.
and we can talk about why that is, but there's a lot of good reasons for that. But if you're a sitting executive, you can't sit on the board of any company in your industry because that's a conflict for you.
Right.
So
Right.
you're going to be on the board in an industry where you don't have any background.
Right.
So there's even more learning to do. Someone I know recently went on the board of, and again, it was a diversity recruitment thing, and they went on the board of a mining company, and they'd never even seen a mine.
Right.
And in
Right.
their orientation, it was just to talk to the CFO and all these people. And they said, I'd like to go to a mine. and,
Right. Right. Yeah.
like, and just walk the floor. And sometimes it's to go to the
Yeah.
lab or
Yeah.
go to the orchard or go to the loading dock or the warehouse or whatever. You don't want to become an economic tourist where you're flying all around on the company's dime to sort of sexy locations. And, oh yeah, I really need to see that small
Mhm.
operation in Honolulu, but I really do think that for many people, sort of site visits are really, really useful. And in the book, we talk about, the pros and cons of site visits and some of the watch outs in doing that. But the first thing I would say is right out of the gates, learn as much as you can. And that may mean augmenting the orientation program with things that are going to help you.
Right.
And sort of secondly, and building on that, um, most boards recruited you for a reason. And that's because there was something in your background, even if it was
Mm.
largely driven by a desire to diversify the board. Okay.
Right.
They chose you because there was something in your background where they thought your expertise or your knowledge of this certain area where you're an expert is something they wanted at the board table.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So maybe it's a legal background, maybe it's a marketing background, maybe it's a finance background, but whatever it is,
Right.
you can be sure that they're looking for you to weigh in on those issues when they come up in the board meeting.
Right. Yeah.
And if you don't, they're going to be super disappointed, right?
Right.
So let's say you're a lawyer, you go on this board, there are legal issues that come up, and you sit there and don't say anything. They're
Mhm.
going to
Mhm.
say, what's with that? Like, we
Right.
thought
Right.
he was going to weigh in on these legal issues, okay?
Yeah.
So first of all, you need to be aware of that so that you make sure you fulfill that because they expect that. And secondly, it's a really good idea to get some grounding as to what's going on in that area because that's your wheelhouse and you need to understand the context. So I'll give you an example. There was a guy who went on the board. It was the Fortune 100, and he was a pretty big name in Silicon Valley, and he had just retired. And he went and had coffee with the digital team. Okay,
Right.
if he could do that, the CEO was cool with it, and they were thrilled to just meet this guy because he was like a big name and he was
Right.
coming on their board. But he said, I learned more in that half hour over coffee
Right.
than I would have learned. And so that gave him the foundation. So when some of those issues came up where they expected him to weigh in, he knew more about what the company was doing. And
Right.
it
Right.
gave him a foundation. So I would say the second thing. The third thing is the single biggest challenge for any first timer on a board is learning and understanding that line between governance and management.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And it is human nature. If you've been or are currently are a senior executive or C-suite executive, you go on a board and you just walk into the board meeting and you start asking some of the questions you'd be asking at a
Mhm.
C-suite meeting at your own company. Okay.
Right.
Well, guess what? You're probably micromanaging because
Right.
you're not
Yep.
there to run the company anymore.
Mhm.
You're now overseeing the management team that's running the
Right.
company.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's that governance management shift. That is the biggest transitional challenge. Now, you'll hear a lot of cutesy statements like nose in, fingers out. Okay. That's all really cute. Nobody really knows what that means when you're in the middle of a board meeting,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
Or you'll have lawyers that pass out some crazy definition, like strategic versus operational. Like, yeah, okay, right. We're talking about, some acquisition and there's a whole bunch of issues. So the best tool I've ever found is a board buddy. And board buddies kind of came into vogue about 10 years ago. And
Mhm.
it was a really good idea. So the idea was that the newbie was assigned to a longer serving director.
Sure.
And the initial idea, and still is, that, it's not a good idea to just say, oh, well, call me if you need anything. People who make board buddies work is they're religious about scheduling a meeting between the pair. It's sort of a few days after the board books come out, but prior to the meeting. So it might be 2 days before the board meeting. They've had a
Right.
chance to read the stuff. They have, now they would probably have a Zoom. And what happens is the incumbent can tell the newbie, hey, on item 2, I want you to understand a little bit of the politics around this thing, because
Right.
this thing comes
Right.
up every year. Half the board thinks it's a really bad idea, but they've let the CEO go with it, like whatever. And that in itself is valuable to a new director because, number one, you're not asking dumb questions in the meeting. And number two, you understand a little bit of the landscape of the politics around
Right.
some of these issues, which you're never going to get in a traditional orientation. So that in itself is valuable. But I
Right.
started to notice about 5 years ago that when the newbie was somebody who'd never been on a board before, they were using these sessions to test out questions. So they would say to the
Oh, okay.
incumbent, okay,
Yeah.
on item number 2, I want to ask this. And the incumbent would
Mm,
say, that's a great question and it's totally at a governance level. Or they might say, no, you know what? That's kind of micromanaging. Let's
mm,
talk about what you really want to get at, and let's see if we can reframe this so it's more of a governance level question. Now, people are really smart, and one or two of these sessions won't do the job. But typically, once you've done the fourth one, and certainly if you've done this over the course of your first year, you not
yeah.
only get it, you've absolutely mastered the
Right.
governance management line.
Right.
And that is a skill that you now have for the rest of your life. And
Right.
so, that I think is really important for a new director.
Yeah, and I think probably that's what empowers you to say something at the board meetings, right? Which is you've got the information now, and you. I remember when I first started working consulting, my best friend was data. Data was my best friend because uh, I would sit in a meeting with all these senior folks, and the only thing that I had were the facts. And so they could say whatever they want. And they'd say, well, was the trend for last year over year 10%? And it's kind of like what you're saying is that knowing more about the context and about sort of collecting the data points, not just about the business, to your point, but really around the politics around some of the topics that are coming on. It really gives you that ability to kind of make some bold statements, right? And that's
Yeah.
what makes you an effective board member.
It
Um,
really can, and the other thing about that is that it gives you an opportunity to, if you use these things, to just develop professionally,
mhm,
and
mhm.
it expands your horizons. And because a lot of people who are senior executives who are sitting on the other side of the board table, they want to use that as a development experience, and I think that's what it can do for you.
Right, gotcha. So the title of your book is Boardroom Star, right? Become a Boardroom Star. What would you say are one or two characteristics of a superstar, right? And what are a couple of things that impede people from becoming a boardroom superstar or boardroom star?
Well, I define a boardroom star quite simply, actually. I think there's really two items to it. Number one is they are somebody who, when they make contributions in the board discussion, they're adding a lot of value.
Right.
So they're bringing relevant points to bear. They're asking really good questions and governance level questions. And they're bringing fresh perspectives so that the board, when this person talks, the board listens because they
Right.
know they have
Sure.
something really worthwhile to say. And so that's, I would say, the first hallmark of a boardroom star. Now, there's a
Okay.
lot of things we can talk about that go into getting there, but that's one. The second is, I think we think about stars as somebody who sort of, they're in the limelight, they're outshining their fellow directors, that
Right.
sort of thing. By contrast, a boardroom star is somebody who understands that boards are governance teams. Okay,
Mhm.
governance is a team sport. And so the second
Right.
attribute of a boardroom star is that there's somebody who contributes to the overall effectiveness of the board as a whole. And the
Right.
more that you move up in board leadership position, whether that is chairing a board committee or chairing the board itself, the more
Mhm.
you're going to be focusing on advancing the board as a team. Okay. So you need both, because if you're somebody who's just a great team player, but you're not really making solid contributions in the meeting, you're
Right.
never going to be considered a boardroom star.
Right. Sure.
But by contrast, if you're somebody who's really brilliant and you're bringing in great points, but you're just a lousy team player, you seem to want constantly to hog the airtime and
Right.
you
Right.
know play gotcha with management and show how smart you are. You're going to get on that list of people we'd really like to replace, as
Right.
opposed to being bored. So I would say those are sort of the twin hallmarks, and then if you like, we can go a little deeper on that, or whatever you want to do.
Yeah. Well, we would have to have you back to talk more about this book. I would love that once the book has had time in the market to kind of make the impact, and you've got feedback. I would love to hear that feedback. Um, I was going to ask you something. The humility aspect that you're talking about, I think that's what you're talking about, is being a humble leader that is strong in the facts, but at the same time knows when to speak, right? And
Well,
knows
I don't know how humble most board members are. So
no,
no, I mean, most board members really aren't that humble, but I mean, these are really highly sophisticated, very accomplished people. One of
yeah,
the things I actually like about the job is that these people do not suffer fools. Okay.
sure, yeah,
And so the boardroom is like the highest wire act in corporate America.
true,
And I
yes,
love it because it's challenging. When I used to be a lawyer, I remember some of even the senior partners, they were like really intimidated if they had to go in and talk to the CEO of a client. Okay.
right,
I get 10 of them. Okay. I have a room with 10. And if they're not all CEOs, and there were CFOs, they're investment bankers, they're ex Big Four partners, they're like whatever it is, that's what I got. And I got like 10 of them,
hmm hmm
and they're really smart and they're really challenging. It is like it, but I'm kind of an adrenaline junkie, so I love it. But I wouldn't really say they're humble. What
okay,
what I think though that they do is they understand, people who are real boardroom stars, they understand that power in the boardroom is different. Okay.
sure,
When
right,
you're an executive, you derive credit and power from your decisions. Okay. You've
hmm
made a decision to make this acquisition. You've made a
right,
decision to do this bond issue. You've made a decision to hire this person as your, chief of staff or whatever it is. Good
right, right,
decisions, right? In the board, they're all group decisions. Okay.
hmm
Power in the boardroom is about the ability to influence. Okay. It's
okay,
about the ability to influence. And, some people are of the view, well, I'm just going to, throw my weight around and show everybody how smart I am. We call
right,
that grandstanding. That tends to
yeah,
detract from the power and influence that they actually have. In
right,
fact, it's
right,
typically viewed as insecurity.
right,
The people who tend to do that are actually, it comes up all the time when I do director evaluations, and I'll say, well, who are the, directors you think are really effective and who are less effective? And they'll talk about, he has to just eat up all this board time showing us all how smart he thinks he is, right? So it's this
right, right,
grandstanding thing, and it's detracting. And what's really interesting is very often, not always, but very often, the person who's getting that feedback is somebody who I would say their CV is perhaps not quite as impressive as some of the other
okay,
directors. Okay.
right,
It's
right,
almost like they feel they have to prove that they
mhm,
belong
sure,
in the boardroom. Okay.
yeah,
But
yeah,
by doing that, they're actually detracting further, right? They're coming
right,
across as insecure. They're not really seen as good team players. They're just seen as wasting the board's time with self-aggrandizement. So, that's kind of how I would characterize the dynamic a little different.
gotcha, yeah. Well, I can hardly imagine. And what I wanted to also talk to you about was sort of the board dynamics and boardroom star in different kinds of boards too, right?
Sure.
Like corporate boards and public sector. Um, there are a number of my clients who are also experienced board members. And, some people have, as you've seen many times before, they've left the executive world and they kind of want to
Yeah.
make a living now.
Yeah.
Um,
They're
I know
professional
this
directors.
is
Yeah.
we hadn't talked about this before our call, but I would just be interested in knowing what you have to say to them. Like they're used to maybe a bit of a grind and the dynamic of a board, but now they're looking for something else that might sort of fulfill another part of they're constantly chasing after some sort of board, right? What
Well,
would you say to people like that, and what's your
so
advice?
I think that retired executives make great directors, and I think
Hmm.
that people who
Okay.
leave corporate life and sit on a number of boards, they can be some of the most valuable directors. There's some of the
Sure.
real boardroom stars I've worked with, so I think highly of that path.
Right.
But a couple of things around that are that why do people go on boards? Okay. Um,
Hmm.
most of them don't do it for the money. Okay.
Okay.
Some do. And they're often the worst directors because they need the money and therefore they won't stand up to management. They won't make tough calls
Right.
because they're afraid of, I talk about that there's two kinds of board leaders, there's champions and there's preservationists. Okay. And champions, a lot of the people I have the privilege of working with are, chairs and board leaders that I would call champions.
Mm.
And they really care about making their board the absolute best that it can be.
Right. Right.
They're kind of type A's in the sense that if they're leading like an audit committee or nominating governance committee, and there's other people that sit on other audit committees in other boards,
Right.
they want them to say that theirs is the best, right? They
Right.
want it to be great. They want executives to come out of the meeting and kind of go, well, maybe not every meeting, but many meetings and kind of go, wow, our board is really great. Like it might be a little intense. They might offer some challenging questions, but man, do they kick stuff around and do they ever
Right.
bring good points in there?
Right.
And
Right.
they really that's what a champion is all about. They're all about creating an excellent board. Um, by contrast, you'll have a preservationist who's somebody who's really impelled by the status of being on the board, and they care more about just maintaining. I mean, for them, their
Mhm.
objective is to stay on the board as long as humanly possible and
Right.
preferably in
Right.
some kind of board leadership position.
Right.
And it tends to be more status than income for them, although it can be both. They're
Right.
not terribly interested in excellence. Mediocrity is perfectly fine as far as they're concerned.
Okay.
Excellence can be threatening to them. And we used
Wow.
to see them a lot more in the 20th century. We saw them in the first decade of the century as well. I still see them from time to time, but I see a lot more sort of champions because it's different.
Right.
And then
Right.
when you go back to why do retired executives serve on boards, um, most people serve on boards because they have had um, a really great career and they've learned so much and they
Mhm.
want to take that lifetime of business expertise and everything they've learned and leverage that to benefit the company whose board that they serve on. That's
Right.
really why most people join boards, and
Right.
they
Sure.
find it intellectually fun to learn about a new industry. As I mentioned before, it's a high stakes adrenaline game. Everybody's really smart. It's
Right.
really challenging in there. They love the adrenaline rush and the intellectual rush of their peers,
Mhm.
and they love the issues, but they really want to. Most board members genuinely want to help guide the company they govern to success. And
Right.
I really honor that because that's what I think a good director should want to do.
Right. Yeah. I think it probably takes a lot of courage and gumption and self confidence, I guess, really, what it comes down to be an effective board leader. And especially as you said earlier, to be a unique, offer a unique value proposition in the context of a group or a team, right? A committee.
Yeah.
That's critically important. One of the things that I often see is people who've had experience in boards saying that they weren't able to find their place. They weren't able to find where it was that they were the most, valuable use of. So it often felt like to them that they were sort of redundant, that they were brought in to do certain things, but they were not courageous enough to say the right thing or whatever it was. So it became sort of bland, right? It's an experience that's sort of bland that way.
Well, part of that has to do with the leadership of the board.
Okay.
If you have a preservationist board leader, those are pretty lackluster meetings. And that leader really just wants to protect the status quo. If you have a champion, they want to make the best of the talent around their board table. Their meetings are actually really fun.
Right.
And if
Sure.
they don't feel somebody is, and it gets back to performance management, it's
Mhm.
not just about, those 49% that 700 directors think need to be replaced.
Right.
It's
Right.
about how do you cultivate the board talent that you have, you
Hmm.
know? And I don't think boards on the whole are very good at that. And I think that's as we get into the third decade of the 21st century, it's actually exactly 20 years from last week when Enron fell. And
Wow.
so
Okay.
yeah,
30
so for the
years.
first
Okay.
2 decades, we've seen boards make a big shift away from this sort of country club dynamic, the sort of being on a board as a reward and, this kind of thing,
Hmm.
to, no, it's actually a real job and it's a really important job, and a lot of people are relying on you, from investors to people that work at the
Right.
company to their executives to communities they serve. There's so much that rides on the decisions you make in the boardroom, and so we've seen that shift. Where I think we're going to see a little bit more of a shift as we enter the third decade is for board leadership to become uh, more proactive in terms of not only addressing performance issues, but also really cultivating strong director talent and making the most of the talent in the boardroom. And part of the reason I wrote Boardroom Star was because you've got this unprecedented level of director recruitment, and I just want those people to hit it out of the park. They have so much to bring to the board
Right.
table, and
Gotcha.
but so do most directors. I mean, this is not a situation anymore where, oh, this is the friend of so and so that came on the board.
Right.
There is an arduous recruitment process for most board members, and they were carefully chosen
Hmm.
because they brought a point of view and expertise into the board table. And so cultivating that and getting the best out of those board members, I really think, is where we're going over the next 10 years.
Right. Gotcha. Now, I would love to have you back for a number of different questions that I've had. One of which is, the question always comes up about, where is it that I find board roles, right? And how do I find the right ones that are for me? And what questions do I need to ask? So I know that's a bigger question. And I kind of want to get into content, if it's okay, Bev, with you
Yeah.
next time, because there's a
Yeah.
lot of rich stuff here. Um, but I'm going to let you go because it's top of the hour, and I know that we're going to honor that. But thank you very much for your participation. I have a few rapid fire questions for you, if you
Sure.
don't mind.
No, I don't mind. It's been a real privilege. And thank you so much, Simi. I really enjoyed our conversation. I'd be happy to do
No
that.
problem. Yeah, no, and I'm a fellow Canadian. I don't know if you know that.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
do know that. Yeah,
yeah.
because I
So
sent you a copy of the book up in Toronto. So,
yes, that's right. That's right.
and my
Um,
parents live in Toronto. So,
yeah. Well, it started snowing here, so it's good that you're not here right now. But okay. So first question is, what's your alter ego profession? If you weren't doing what you're doing now, what would you love to be doing?
um, I would love to change the culture in law firms, because I think that there are so
Oh,
many talented people in law firms that are so unhappy and so unfulfilled.
wow.
And I think that the leadership in the law firms can really do much better than they have for those talented people. I know very few lawyers who are genuinely happy in their work,
Hmm.
and I think that that's an area. And it's interesting. When I was a partner at Hay, um, they had a team of people that were doing that kind of work, and they would invite me occasionally to their meetings. But I was trying to grow this global board practice, and I said, it's not that I don't believe in this. I think it's really important, but there's only so much I can do. But I think since that day, I've always had that in the back of my mind as something that I would be interested in doing. And honestly believe that many of the tools that I've developed in working with boards could be adapted to a law
Yes.
firm partner culture.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. That's. I didn't expect such an academic answer, but okay, that's great. I think, was that one of the books that you wrote?
Well, my very first book that I wrote, which was in '98, was a book called Jumping Ship: How to Navigate Your Way to a More Successful Job or Career. And it came from when I was in Vancouver in the, I guess, early '90s. Just after I'd left Canadian Airlines, I was leading courses because I'd gone in and out of law. Like, I'd gone to the airline and I wasn't in a legal role all the time at the airline. And
Right.
so I was doing courses for the Canadian Bar Association for lawyers that didn't want to be lawyers anymore. And we would just sell these things out,
Right,
and
right.
I knew I wanted to do a book, and everybody said you should do a book. And I wanted to write my first book before I was 40. And so that was the book I wrote. And it
Gotcha.
actually got an honorable mention in the Globe and Mail Best Business Books of the Year in '98.
Wow.
So yeah,
Okay.
so I think that's always kind of been like sort of plan B,
Yeah.
if the board thing went sideways.
Gotcha. What's one book title or movie title that would best describe you?
Oh, a movie title? Um,
Or book. Yeah, or book title.
or a book? I don't know. I have no idea. I mean,
Let me try to put one there. We've had what trains, planes, and automobiles from someone
no,
before.
not anymore because nobody's traveled for 18 months. So
No, but describing the pace of their lives, that they can't sit still. That's what they were saying. So
yeah, I don't know. I don't really. Yeah, I mean, I love travel, so I've
yeah,
missed it, and so I don't find it arduous or daunting, which is, I think, what that sort of implies. I don't think that's really,
sure,
yeah,
sure. So what's one word that you love?
a word that I love. Satin.
Latin? Okay.
Satin. That's a nice word, isn't it?
Okay, it
Satin.
is nice. It's very
Yeah.
nice. What's one word that you hate?
Word that I hate. Dandruff.
All right. I'll take that. I'll
I
take
don't
that.
know.
I've had some very strange answers. Trust me, very strange
Yeah.
answers. But that's one there. That's
Yeah. I don't know.
I won't ask you the personal question of why, but what's last thing? What's one COVID hobby or habit that you developed?
Oh, well, I learned how to self-publish books. And
Mhm.
so, every book I had done up to now had been done, well, with one fun exception, but every book I had done, every board book I had done was done with a major publishing house. So it was done with Wiley or Palgrave, or, even my little jumping ship book was done with a major house. So I learned the ins and outs of self-publishing, and
Mhm,
I
mhm.
think it's been great because, I think there's a point in your career where you probably should go with a mainstream house, but I think I've moved past that, and we're also in an era where, people aren't going to bookstores, everybody's buying their books on Amazon, so
Right.
it lends itself. So I put together this whole team of, copy editors, cover designers, interior layout people. I have a great guy in Toronto actually who does, I did an audiobook for Boardroom Star. I did
Yeah.
an audiobook
Yeah.
for Great Companies Deserve Great Boards. We actually loaded it this morning. I
Right.
learned how to do all of that during COVID. And it's so interesting because I was keynoting a conference in the Ukraine earlier this week. And of course, it was done by webcast, and there were big televisions and stuff. And then right after that, they're like, "We would like to buy the rights to translate your book into Russian."
Wow.
Yeah, and, I've never had that even from a mainstream house.
That's
So,
incredible.
yeah, so, I mean,
Congratulations on it.
and it gives me also, the possibility, like, I've started talking with somebody about, they just wanna license, like,
Mhm.
250 copies, or there's a directors association here, and they want a bulk order, and
Right,
we
right.
can do that, whereas when you're dealing with a mainstream publishing house,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
gotta go through them, and there's all this red tape, and they want their cut, and
Right.
so it's given me so much freedom, and it's been
Mhm,
really a lot of fun. So
mhm.
that's been my kinda COVID thing, yeah.
That's great. That's great. Congratulations. That's
Thanks
awesome.
a lot. It's been fun, but I'll also tell you I'm kinda glad it's coming to an end. So, because I've been, literally writing for about 18 months, and so it's
Yeah,
time. It's time. So I told myself by the end of this year, I'm, like, gotta get those books out and get
yeah,
them, and
right.
get back in the boardroom.
Until, the next round where you have inspiration, maybe in about 5 or 10 years, then you'll write another couple of books.
Well, Simeon, that's exactly it. Like, when Great Companies Deserve Great Boards came out, I kinda spilled my guts about everything I'd learned
Mhm.
over a decade into that
Right,
book,
right.
and so everybody was like, "Well, we want you to do another one," and I said, "Well, no, I need more time," and,
Mhm.
that was kinda where these books came from, and, Boredom Star was almost like an afterthought, but in a way, it's my favorite of all three of them. The
Right.
one I'll just show you. So this is a book called New CEOs and Boards: How to
Okay.
Build a Great Board Relationship and a Great Board. And this will probably come out in the first quarter of
That's
2022.
one of them?
That's the newest one. It's not public
Okay.
yet. That's
Okay.
not okay, but I have some
Wow.
advanced copies,
Uh-huh.
and if you are a new CEO and you would like a copy of this book, then by all means get in touch with me. We can mail one out to you. We're looking to get testimonials from new CEOs on the book
Okay.
because when you think about it, when you become the chief executive officer for the first time in your life, you don't have a boss. You don't have one person that you have to manage. You have a
Mhm.
board. Okay.
Yes.
That
Yes.
is a huge transition. And it takes between 15 and 20% of your time. And
Mhm.
most people aren't expecting that. And often a CEO's first instinct is to really cultivate a good relationship with the board chair. And
Mhm.
that's not a bad instinct, but it's not a one dimensional thing. You have to build and maintain relationships with everybody on the board. And so that's really what that book is from. And then the sort of the twin piece of that is I don't think I've ever met a CEO who didn't want to make some changes to their board.
Right.
And yet some of them are very reluctant to do that. They're afraid they'll alienate the board or they go about it in a really clumsy way.
Right.
So part of that book also talks about, how you can what tools are available and processes are available that will make those changes where the board actually feels they're leading it. You lead them from behind into some of these
Right.
tools, and they're going to make the exact same changes that you want, but it's not going to draw down any of your political capital as a
Right.
CEO.
Right.
So that's what that book's about, and that's going to be coming out in the first quarter of 2022.
Gotcha. Wow. And you know what? I look at that book and I think there's so many of my clients that would have benefited from that or can benefit from that right now. Um,
Well,
I
you let
think
me know, and I'm happy to send a couple of
sure.
copies out to your clients. Absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely, definitely. Yeah, and the last thing I would say is that I think the misconception that first-time board members often have if they're looking for a board is that they have been in so many executive roles, therefore that equates to they're now ready to be on a board, right? Without fully understanding that sometimes it's not actually about what you've done as an executive. It's a lot more to do with what puzzle piece is that board missing, right?
Exactly.
And you need to be
Exactly.
you need to add that value there, which may
Yeah.
or may not employ what you've done in the past.
Yeah.
And so, and I have to confess, I don't often know what exactly the guidance might be, but that book looks really great. So I can't wait for that. But yeah, I certainly will reach out to you if I have any
Yeah,
active
if you have
clients.
some clients that would like to see that, I just unpacked 75 of them
Wow.
from the printer in Minneapolis, and so we're sending some of them out to, new CEOs over the next, like, couple of months because we wanna get some feedback around that. So, yeah,
Mhm.
we're happy to do
Great.
that.
Well, thank you so much, Bev. I really appreciate your time. It's past the hour, so I want to respect that. But thank you so much, and all the very best. I know you do very well, and I can't wait to hear about maybe the next time will be when you're available. That is,
Mhm.
will be the insights coming from this Board Star book, and also maybe the next book as it comes out as well. So
Yeah, I think the next book could actually be really fun if you'd
it
like to
will be,
I'm happy to talk about Boardroom Stars some more too, but I think the next book could be really fun.
yeah,
So,
yeah, I think
yeah.
so too. But thank you so much, and just stay behind here. I'll put you on backstage, and I'll just close up
Okay.
here. Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
so much, Simeon. It was a real privilege, and I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, thank you. All right.
Okay.
All right. So another awesome, really wonderful interview. It's the first time I've had a board expert right on this show, and it's such a hot topic these days. I'm finding that maybe it's because the media is covering so much about the importance of boards for different companies that are making decisions about laying off people, right, or trying to rebuild some of their capabilities. Even up in Canada, there's recently one of our telecom companies, one of the three, four major ones, had a big shakeup in their board, and all of a sudden, people that don't normally know what boards are talking about, oh, it's a major kind of political piece there, and so I wonder if that's what's happening as well. But if you are interested again in looking into boards, and you've had the experience that really kind of gives you the battle scars to really give the wisdom that you want to give, I really encourage you to pick up the book. Again, it's right here, and it's available. It's a beautiful cover too as well, and it's a great read. But and also reach out to Bev, reach out to myself. We'll be more than happy to connect with you. And but until next time, all the best. Have a great weekend, and I'll talk